Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome to the podcast today Roland Betancourt. Roland is the Chancellor's Professor of Art History at UC Irvine and the author of the recently released Disneyland and the Rise of Automation: How Technology Created the Happiest Place on Earth. Roland, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure and honor to be here.
I like to hear that. So, Matt, why don't we just start at the beginning? And how did you come to write about Disneyland? I imagine your situatedness, your placedness, to introduce an academic term, in Southern California brought you to this topic. But what made you want to write about Disney? Because my understanding is your background is in Byzantine art history of the medieval period. So, how did you come to writing about the happiest place on earth?
Yeah, it's a complicated story. First of all, I'm in Southern California, so it made sense. Byzantium is a very long ways away. Being in California, something that I was always warned about when I was starting my job there nearly 12 years ago now. I'm also from South Florida. I'm born and raised in Miami, so amusement parks are sort of in the blood. And I think we don't give Florida credit for how weird it is in terms of not just the Disneys and the Universal Studios, but also the roadside attractions that are still very much a part of that state. And so it was something that I've always been interested in. And really, as an art historian, I'm interested in sort of the power of images and how things work, how the built environment works, how it controls us, how it motivates us in many ways. And Disneyland just felt like the perfect place. If I had been able to write about any theme park, I probably would have been writing about Epcot Center or something like that. But I really wanted to sink my teeth into something that was local, that I could talk to people. And honestly, the best part of working about on Disneyland in Southern California is that everyone has a personal connection. So everyone always has fun, weird stories to tell.
Weird stories about Disneyland. I can never imagine. Before we get into it, have you ever been to Club 33?
I
Real
have
Disney
not.
heads will know what that is. You have
Yeah,
not. You
no,
should
I
be invited
haven't.
after this book.
It's really funny. One person at one point invited me, and then I think the pandemic happened, and that didn't happen. So it's on the to do
Oh,
list.
it interrupted your life. And the reason that I know what that is, there was a period, I recently had a child, and there was a period when he was very young, and my wife and I became obsessed with like Disney adults. And so we started watching these like YouTube videos of people like going around the park. And obviously that's orthogonal to what we're talking about here, but it's just fascinating that this place has created this like cult like status, some of the most important iconography of the 20th and 21st centuries. So like I know a little bit about Disney, which is why one of the reasons that I wanted to do this interview.
Yeah, no, it's actually really interesting. We're like culturally obsessed with Disney adults right now. There was a best-selling book on it. There are constantly stories everywhere on in every news outlet about Disney adults, and it's like really fascinating that we're in this moment. I have a lot of theories about it. I think being in culture wars really sort of sparks this interest in these sort of mythical places, the Las Vegas, the Disney's, these sort of recreations of history. But they're really, maybe it's also just a healthy dose of the generic escapism and reassurance that these places offer. But we really are in sort of a peak moment on like the Disney adult discourse.
Yeah, one of the things that I found particularly fascinating is correct me if I'm wrong, but the main street of Disneyland is supposed to be a representation of Walt's childhood Missouri city of basically the turn of the century. And so one of the most interesting videos I saw was that someone went to the his city. And
Hmm.
it's like a dilapidated Midwestern town. And so like you could it's almost like in a script they would tell you it's two on the nose between like the sort of fantasy main street you find at Disneyland and Disney World, and then like the actual existence of Midwestern Missouri in the 21st century.
Yeah, this is a fun fact. Argues about everyone argues about everything about Disney, and especially Disneyland. It's always funny walking around the park, and mainly Disney adults, but sort of anyone that knows anything about the park in a sort of YouTube influenced way. They're always like jockeying with information. It's like, well, did you actually know that this is the case? And then it's like, no, you're wrong. It's actually this. And Main Street is one of those places. There's this belief that it's modeled after his basically what becomes his hometown. He was born in Chicago, but there's like these various theories that it's modeled after like studio backlots and that vision of like a turn of a century. Probably one of the most interesting things is that if you've ever been to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, they had a Main Street exhibition that started in the 40s, and it is pretty much to the T like what Main Street became. And that's one of the places that Disney sent his basically research team to look into. And so that's another fun fact that nobody really talks about, but I think one of the most interesting sort of ideations of what Main Street is. So next time you're in Chicago, I definitely recommend going.
No, that's really interesting. I'm sure that itself was modeled on the World's Fairs, which obviously Chicago
Mm-hmm.
had a very famous one in the late 19th century, and they were continuing throughout the mid-century. So it's all this like creation of this American nationalist myth. But let's turn to the book and let's start to discuss this issue of automation because I actually did a little work on this through brainwashing, which was a very important theme in early Cold War literature, emergent from the Korean War. There were fears about all these POWs becoming brainwashed, and then sort of the figure of the automaton becomes crucial. Ralph Ellison talks about it. Betty Friedan talks about it. You have the right wing talking about it, sort of this like automated, non-thinking person, which I'm sure there is a dialogical interaction here between what's going on at Disney. So why don't we turn to this issue of automation? Where does it come from? This issue of robots, which is what it's some European language for slave, right? Or a take on slave or something along those lines. But what is going on in the early post war period about automation and sort of the social fears that are figured around it?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting parts in doing the research of this book is that I stupidly, like, I think many of us assume that automation is sort of as American as apple pie, essentially. Like, you ask, if somebody were to have asked me, like, 10 years ago, like, where does automation come from? I would probably say something like, oh, the Ford assembly line, so like early 20th century, but it's sort of always been there. And I think one of the things that, as I started realizing that I was not going to write, as a medievalist, a book about castles and fairy tales and theming. And I was drawn to the technology. I think what really clicked was when I started realizing that, oh, as Disney is being built, the word automation has been essentially coined in 1952 for a popular audience. It's spreading like wildfire. It is the talk of everyone sort of in the unions. There's this promise that it will free us from drudgery, very much connected to these ideas of the automaton and the slave as well, and that it's going to sort of either leave us all unemployed or give us all this free time to that was then considered to be like the most pressing social issue of the time. What are we going to do with all this free time that automation is going to give us? Not just automation in the home, but automation also at work. The idea that we would
Turns out it's
probably
make bets on Kalshi and Polymarket. That is
right,
the answer.
exactly. Yeah, no, there was this idea that literally the work week was just going to continue shrinking because, I mean, to their credit, like it had been shrinking throughout the early 20th century. And
And
so
there's the famous Keynesian idea about like what are our grandchildren going to do? Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah,
all that stuff.
exactly. So there's this like long legacy. It's funny. You like open a Life magazine and they're talking about like Aristotle and like what to do with leisure. And so it was really, both as a promise and a panic. I think it's something we can definitely relate to with sort of the place that we are in the conversation with AI, very similar. And, I think even if you looked at like a John Oliver episode from like 2018 on automation, the concerns were very similar to what we were having, the conversations we were having in the 50s. Really, the only thing that sort of changed that focus has been sort of AI coming onto the scene. And so when I saw this, it was sort of really fascinating to think. I was at a party once and I told someone, I'm writing a book on Disneyland and automation. And they were like, yeah, so what? Like that seems obvious and common sense. And I think that was sort of I like at first I was like, oh damn, what am I going to do if it's so obvious? But then I realized, well, that's sort of the whole point. That in a period where there was so much concern, this place that was so obviously this automated paradise was in some ways having to introduce people to these technologies and also treading the line of also not how do you avoid the criticism? Walt Disney isn't like, I'm making this automated world where I've replaced all human labor, but there is still this idea that, I wonder how many parents like walked into Disneyland and recognized the same control consoles on the rides that they were sort of pushing at work, at, you know, during the work week. So these are really the concerns that I think really led me to this. And what I think surprised me the most is that it's not just a problem of the 50s. What you see when you trace the history of Disneyland, but also other amusement parks, is that throughout the late 20th century, every time there's a new automation technology, a new system that's on the market, they very quickly adopt it to try to create these new experiences. So they're really sort of at the forefront of how we get acclimated to a lot of these automated technologies that are really locked behind factory walls most of the time.
That's interesting. I laughed when you said, people were like, "Wow, that's so obvious," because it's not supposed to be obvious, right? You're not supposed to go into Disneyland and be walking around riding rides thinking about the automation. You're supposed to be enraptured in this experience, and everything's sort of and cloaked behind the mystery and magic of the theme park. And yet, at the same time, without even noticing, if they're doing their job right, you're being exposed to all of these technologies of automation and kind of that aren't necessarily ubiquitous yet but will be.
Yeah, one industry leader in the 1950s called it imaginative camouflage for theming. That it's you're, and I love that because it was this idea that like some of these rides were also modeled on like earlier attractions that Disney had sort of spruced up. They're very clear in the sort of professional conferences that they're going to that they're basically just giving it the Disney touch on these older type of attractions, like going through a dark building in a car and seeing different scenes and all that. It was like we haven't invented anything new. We just spruced it up. And this idea, it's really interesting. I was having a conversation with someone recently that had read the book, and they said, I had never thought about the sort of jerkiness and movements of the ride, but when I read your description in the book, I could remember them. And I thought that was a really interesting sort of maybe paradox, maybe not, that inherently we're always aware of these experiences of the machine, but we really sublimate them and push them down below our awareness. And I think in some ways, one of the matured sort of arguments that I sort of came to in the book was, and I say matured as in like in the process of writing, I began to realize that one of the strengths that these types of spaces have is that it's not that they hide machines, it's not that they completely erase them, is that they teach us how to ignore machines. It teaches us that like, oh yeah, these jerks and movements are part of the course and you're just going to ignore them because you're not supposed to be aware of that. And I think I think about that a lot and like, people are panicking about AI is going to steal my job, but then you're also having ChatGPT tell you what to eat for dinner and like having these sort of leisure like experiences with technology. And I think that's the way that you sort of like learn to not be scared, but also learn to sort of push that below the surface and make it a part of daily life in a way that you don't see it anymore.
I think it'd also be interesting to talk a little bit about the theme park. Where does the theme park come from, and what is the theme park's relation to machines or industrial production? I mean, you start the book with Coney Island. That's from where I'm from. So I remember growing up and going to Coney Island, and it was quite dilapidated. I haven't been back. It's apparently like a hipster cool thing, but like it was very dilapidated when I was growing up as a child and as a teenager. But it had its heyday. Famous immigrants communities going down Ocean Parkway, arriving at Coney Island in the early 20th century, maybe even late 19th, is when it began. But where does the theme park come from, and how does it relate to industrial production?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. Let me start with Coney Island. I find Coney Island to be really funny in this history because it did have its heyday sort of like peaking in the 20s. Um and everyone like Walt Disney really liked to say, I'm not trying to repeat Coney Island, those places are terrible. And it's really funny, like everyone in the amusement park industry was like, Coney Island's horrible. And I've got some great reports of industry leaders they do sort of tours around the country every year to see what's up at amusement parks in the 40s and 50s. And one of them is just like, went to Coney Island. It's getting worse every year. And it's sort of funny. Like, I mean, it was sort of an easy thing to pick on because everyone agreed that it was pretty dilapidated already by the 40s. So it's an interesting part of the history of like how the amusement parks get villainized. I think that the history of theme parks are really interesting in how you trace it. I think that there's something fundamental about this desire to unsettle time and space and really what the theme park is. And so I remember I was talking to one Disney Imagineer and I said, I work on the Middle Ages. I'm working on Disney right now. And he said to me, why would you want to work on an amusement park when you have like Gothic cathedrals? They're basically the same thing. And I love that. And I actually do teach a graduate seminar at UCI called Simulacral Spaces, where we trace this history of like places that like to want to unsettle our relationship to the here and now and sort of take us somewhere that's either spiritual, divine, heavenly, back in time, and so on. Now, what's really interesting about sort of the modern amusement park as it develops really in the 19th century is that you really do see that this relationship with um, various modes of transportation and particularly sort of conveyors of goods and production are really inherently a part of like where there's inspiration for a lot of these rides. I mean, there's a reason why you have mine car rides. It's because the same technologies that would power mine cars and how that would work were then sort of applied to the amusement park. I mean, one of my favorites is the sort of like idea of a log ride, like what you would associate with like something like Splash Mountain. You have the Calico, no, that's the mine train, the log ride at Knott's Berry Farm. And it's really interesting because you had basically, these are based on log flumes from logging. And so you would have basically loggers who would ride the logs. And that's really how these associations between how do you turn these sort of factory means into forms of amusement really sort of were translated. And that history is something that goes down to this day. And I really love that because it speaks so much about the sort of seduction of these hidden worlds of factories and manufacturing, and the idea that the amusement park is a mediator where you can come actually experience what these things look like. But rather than, going to Dearborn, Michigan and walking through the Ford factory, you actually get to like ride the car that's being manufactured. And that's I really what I think is like, it's, especially like as a child of the 90s, I feel like it's like the how it's made, like unwrapped, seeing behind the scenes.
And then, of course, this sort of third leg on this stool is Disney. So, how does Disney come from, or go rather, from being an animator to a studio mogul to opening amusement parks? And Roland, I don't know how much you follow it now, but this is basically one of the most profitable parts of the business now that
Yeah.
film and TV are in such decline. It's like you look at the quarterly reports and it's
Yeah.
amusement parks. And I believe I remember hearing that Universal, owned by Comcast, is actually getting rid of the City Walk to basically expand the theme park because the theme park is such a moneymaker in a way that film and TV are no longer moneymakers. So, it was good business thinking by Disney. But how does he come to enter this space? And what does it say, I think, about Disney ideology? What is Disney ideology? And I think it's connected to automation. It's connected to the American century. It's connected to American empire. It's connected to whiteness, gender, all those great things we love talking about as academics. So Disney, go.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're in your work, you tend to see everything through the lens of it. But I think this is also a really interesting moment where we really can compare notes with what's going on in the 50s. And I think a lot of the image of Walt Disney in particular that's been cultivated has always been, I mean, beyond sort of like the critique, sort of like the corporate image that's very much cultivated of him is sort of in many ways like an aloof genius. He cared about his own ideas and those ideas were visionary, but it's not like he was doing anything motivated by corporate demands or money. That's something that gets attributed to like his brother Roy as like the money man. But it's actually really funny because I sort of I'm like that's not convincing to me as a historian looking at this period because you're in a very sort of similar moment. I mean, the studio's having trouble with like money and films. You have the rise of television. In this moment, there was television before, but the FCC had like holds on how many stations could actually be opened, and these bans were being lifted, and television was spreading across the country. The big concern was that, of course, television was keeping people in the home and they were not going to movie theaters. So the movie theater industry was suffering greatly. This is, of course, affecting Walt Disney as well as everyone else in Hollywood, and especially the bigger sort of vertically integrated studios. There have been a bunch of like antitrust cases that have sort of shuffled money around and things like that.
Well, they got rid
And
of their theaters. There's the
yeah,
Paramount decrees
yeah,
of 1948, and so they have to
exactly.
get rid of their theaters. And there's a what is it, Warner Brothers, who like winds up burning like the silver from old film canisters, and they wind up like renting their lot. I mean, like it's like
Yeah,
a desperate time for studios in the
it
50s.
is utterly
All the
desperate.
big budget things aren't really working. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry to
no,
interrupt.
no,
I
no, no.
study this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and this is something that I'm like I'll be publishing in the future about a little, but it's really interesting because yeah, there's the Paramount decree. So basically, Paramount has to sell off their theaters. Then you have ABC, which is like the third network in the sort of television battles behind NBC and CBS, and then you have ABC with all this money because of the selling off of the Paramount theaters. Um, they need to do something with this. And what's really interesting is that, and this is a conversation that really hasn't been explored, and that's what I've been working on, is that on the amusement park side, they're like, oh, like people are not going to be traveling. They are going to be sitting at home watching TV. So how do we incorporate television into the amusement parks? So other amusement parks across the country start like exploring with like bringing celebrities in, bringing people to record shows, the things that we now associate with Disney. And what they begin to realize very early on by the early 50s is that what the theme park is offering people is the ability to have sort of unmediated experience. Like, yeah, you're not going to go to a movie theater because you could have that at home on the TV, but going to an amusement park is actually offering you something special. And I think that's very similar to the place that we are now, in a place where, there's nothing like more dissatisfying to me than going on like any sort of theme park ride today and like having a bunch of screens and being like, I could do this at home, like basically. There's something about sort of this experience of the real and having a sort of immersive space that is sort of on par with that. And at the same time that you have television, you also have the automobile. So people also, when they do get out of the house, they want to go to places that they can drive to. And so this creates a really interesting sort of merging of powers that, for Disney, I don't think it was just that like he was like, oh, I used to take my girls to the park to like a carousel and I wanted to do something fun for myself as well. I think he recognizes that you have the baby boom. These kids are going to be coming of age. They need a place to go. You have the idea of like youth culture being invented in the period and like teenagers as we know them today or as we have known them, and there's a real desire to you know f- fit these needs in a way that also cater to adults. I mean, I like to say that Disney adults are there by design. They've sort of been a crucial tenet from the first days of the park of this is a place really for adults to enjoy. And so the real key word here is diversification. Walt Disney understood that the theme park, the amusement park offered something unique, and that cinematic experience essentially had to be translated into something that was experiential, three-dimensional, something that you went to. And I think that's. I mean, it's wild to look at the quarterly reports from Disney today and be like, oh, it's theme parks and the cruise line that are having the highest profits. That's that's insane. But it's a very similar situation, I think, to where we are right now in this desire for these sort of unmediated experiences and outlets. And I think also, I think a lot of why the community, the sort of conversation about Disney adults is so powerful is because I think places like this also create forms of like friendship and community in real life, or at least the semblance of that, that I think can also draw a lot of people to these places. So, I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but that's my actually my short version of that answer.
Feel free to go into details, but maybe we could focus on it through automation. How does automation fit into this larger project? And particularly, there's this notion of the Cold War and American technological mastery, and
Mhm.
maybe I mean, I study the early Cold War, so I'm looking at it through that lens. But how does automation emergent from World War II? Now there is this global battle to prove that not only the United States will be able to defeat the Soviet Union war, but that its political economic system is superior, is able to provide for more people. Could you talk a little bit about that and how it's instantiated in Disney and maybe by
Yeah.
Disney himself?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite things about the automation panic that's happening sort of in the popular social milieu at the time is that if you look at sort of the more industry facing venues, there's this almost like inverse panic, which is like we haven't automated enough. So there are all these stories of like Russia has a fully automated piston factory, and then it's all these sort of like pundits of the era being like, it's not actually automated, don't worry, but we they will beat us in 10 years, so like we need to speed up. And so there's a real, it's really this idea that like we do have to beat Russia at this sort of newfangled automation thing internally. And what I think is also somebody asked me recently, and we were having a conversation about the book, and someone said, "Do you think that people liked the question of control that is inherent in automation, or did they fear it? And do they like control because they are so stupid that they need to be controlled, or do they like control because they don't know what's happening and it's just happening to them?" And what I said is like, no, it's the bravado of the Cold War. It's like, look at all these spaces that are seamlessly controlled through these machines of automation, and even a space that is, constantly and very much, what I think is really fascinating about this period is that we tend to associate modern Disney today as sort of a relatively secretive organization that doesn't want to share, how they make the quote unquote magic. Walt Disney was on his TV show basically showing off the park because, of course, speaking about television, he started a television show basically to promote the park as part of his deal with ABC to fund the amusement park. But he's also showing the sort of the innards of the park, like how you're there translating, like a crocodile into a robotic crocodile that can actually be sort of repeated. And I think that's the key thing that happens is that ultimately when you have a studio going into this idea of how do I create these experiences that are cinematic, a lot of the studio people who were working on special effects could make gags that would work a few times and that's it. But automation allowed them to produce things that could be running basically 24/7 and offer the same experience for everyone exactly, as they move through these attractions. And so there was a real affordance there. But what you begin to see as well is that Walt Disney, he's always been a bit of a technophile. So he really likes the idea of promoting a lot of his technologies as something deeply associated with the Cold War. So he's very proud to like when they start using magnetic tape to program their so-called audio animatronics, he's very proud to say that like, oh, they're using this on like the Polaris missile or they're using this on nuclear submarines. And even when he opens, the submarine ride in 1949, 1959, there's this idea that he has, the largest submarine fleet in the world. So it really is this way of almost like positioning Disneyland as another nation in the Cold War, or rather sort of like the perfect embodiment of America's military power in the Cold War in a way that's
Well,
also
and also just something is
yeah,
going on in Southern California at this moment. I mean, the Rand Corporation is in Santa
yep,
Monica.
yep.
It's right near Disneyland, and they're the ones who really pioneer game theory and systems
Mhm.
analysis. So there's a Southern California thing happening too, I think.
Oh yeah, totally. And it's really fascinating when they expand their offices for what we now call Imagineering, that was called Wet Enterprises at the moment. They really they take on this old office space that was used to belong to this Studio Girl, I think it was called. It was a basically cosmetics company that was like an MLM type thing. Um, but it was designed by one of the major local Southern California architects who designed a lot of the research campuses for a lot of these think tanks and sort of the aerospace industries. So they really sort of sell the new building, which they've just sort of moved into already pre-made, as being sort of like, their new research and development headquarters, and very much sort of understanding that this will allow with sort of like a perfect flow of sort of the industry of the production of their attractions. And so there's a real desire to position themselves as an R&D corporation on the level of the think tanks and sort of the aerospace industry that was in Southern California, which is so crucial to, they have a lot of people that are coming from aerospace as well that are sort of, sharing their own sort of insights into the space. And that's something that really is there from the very beginning. I mean, the way that Disney actually finds a location for Disneyland is by contracting the Stanford Research Institute, which was a think tank, um, in the Bay Area, but they also had offices in Los Angeles, to basically do take a lot of the methods they had used for like industrial dispersion, basically like how to disperse our cities so that they're not as vulnerable to atomic attack. And they basically use these methods of like population studies and weather studies and all these various metrics of urban location to find what would be the ideal place for Disneyland. In a, particularly, almost like they were targeting sort of the population of tomorrow. So wanting to basically find how the center of the population in Southern California was moving and being able to locate Disneyland in the place that would have the densest concentration of the gravity of the population in a few decades. And so you really see the way in which it's not just Walt Disney saying, "Oh, this tape is used on Polaris." It really is this idea that like the entire logic of the park is coming from this. I think one of the key things about a lot of these think tanks are doing in the period is that they're also just, it's a form of arbitrage. They really want to take these things that they developed for the U.S. government and somehow produce sort of civilian applications so that they can sell these wares and sort of fund things, especially as government contracts are running a bit dry at the end of the 50s and into the 60s. So you really have this sort of logic that permeates the theme park just by virtue of being in Southern California and the sort of industry that had built around the Cold War.
So, Roland, one thing I just wanted to add before we move on is that there's also something about Southern California here. I mean, the Rand Corporation is in Santa Monica. It's quite close. They're also developing game theory and things along those lines. So there's also this notion of California as being at the frontier of this type of post-war thinking. I really think Los Angeles and its environs is really the city of the American century, much more so than New York or anywhere else. There's sort of free thinking, and I think Disneyland is absolutely part of that. One thing I did want to talk about was this issue of control, which I think has become very um, associated with Disney in the popular imagination. I mean, The Simpsons had that joke. They have Roger Meyer based on Walt Disney, and he's a genius. Criticized for his controversial 1939 film Nazi Supermen are our superiors. So there's this notion of Disney as fascist. Obviously, I think Westworld with The Simpsons also did a parody of there. It's like this very like fascist and controlled space. I think is how it's come to imagine. So, and which is obviously the embodiment of this post-war American imaginary of a place that's supposedly free and capitalist and blah blah blah, but is actually defined by like serious social control, which is, and you actually get the automaton as a criticism of capitalism. The man in the gray flannel suit and all these workers going to work in sort of lockstep, and so Disney is part of that. So, could you talk a little bit about Disney and automation and this notion of control?
Yeah, this is like a very interesting sort of part of it because I think that's one of the things that whether you love Disney or you hate Disney, control is such a critical part of how you imagine it. I mean, I love sometimes the sort of extents of paranoia that people think that Disney has control over, which, spending a lot of time in the park and talking to cast members and so on, I'm like, yeah, these things aren't real, most of them. One of my favorite things is like, oh, they're pumping out smells. And I'm like, no, they don't, they do not have the technology. Like we know that that existed in one space, and there's some attractions where you have this type of stuff, but it's not like that. And I talked to someone who used to work in the park, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I was selling popcorn by the train, so I just like it was my own thing that I just decided like whenever the train was pulling up, I would sort of brew a fresh batch so that the smell would like draw people in. But it was sort of like something that he said like that made me a good sort of worker because I knew that. So that there are forms of control that we really associated with Disney that are really either sort of a byproduct of the space or not really there. I think it's sort of how we imagine this place that is so subsumed by these ideas of what this era expected. And it's really interesting because I think the reason why I also want to start there is because I think that working on this era of Disney, it really shows you a lot of the ways in which many of these things the sort of seeds are there of how they develop, especially like in the 80s and 90s, but I don't think they're sort of there at the core. And I think of um, some of the sort of propaganda films that Disney made during World War II. And there's this really wild one of Donald Duck who has a nightmare that he is in a Nazi factory as a Nazi worker, and he's basically like screwing the shells together as they're coming down the assembly line. And it's really interesting in many ways. If you think about uniformity of parts, like there's none of that. Like all the shells are different sizes. He has mandatory vacation, which is like the backdrop of the Alps come out, and he does like exercise, which is just basically forming his body into a swastika. And then periodically there's like images of Hitler that he has to like heil as they come down the assembly line. And it's this critique, of course, of like this idea of like the conforming automata, where by the end of it, Donald Duck is actually like multiple figures. He's become a robot. And then, of course, he wakes up and he realizes he's in the safety of America where he has freedom. And people like Fred Turner have talked about this idea of like the democratic surround, the cultivation of this environment where freedom of choice is sort of extrapolated as a way of basically promoting a citizen that is sort of commensurate with the ideas of America, this sort of consumer republic where consumption allows citizens to also operate a certain way that exercises their freedom. And I think in many ways, a lot of the sort of techniques, like a place like Main Street, is something that is really interesting because I think it does capture this microcosmic idea that you're sort of training citizens in the idea you can walk around and freely consume in the consumer's republic. You have this idea of the promotion of American industry as sponsors for things in the park that really was a sort of, I think, like the liberalism of choice. And I think a lot of this begins to change over time as sort of the theme park as a thing becomes a lot more industrialized, and there's this sort of constant push for like how can we generate more efficiency. And that's really where I think sort of a lot of the critiques that were being made in the 50s and 60s about the dangers of producing automata from these guests really comes into play. And so I think that's a really interesting part of this history as well, that there is a transformation that happens in American culture. And I don't think this is limited to the theme park, where you really have this sort of transition from this, you know, the democratic surround to something that is a lot more akin to what Americans in the 50s feared, of sort of a fascist ideology.
Can we talking about transitions? The transition that seems to happen between the 50s and the 70s you outline in the book, from the theme park as a factory where we're hiding all the factory components from people and creating this myth, to wouldn't it be cool to be in a factory? Let's have rides about being in a factory. Like you talk about it in terms of the water rides, like It's a Small World, Pirates of the Caribbean. I actually want to ask you about Pirates of the Caribbean specifically, but we'll wait for that. But the technology that's used in these things is the same technology that you use to move logs down a river if you're in the logging business, but it's hidden, especially in Pirates. It's really hidden from people's perception. But then in the 70s, you get Splash Mountain, which is like, let's ride a log down a flue and go through the whole process. Like it's very overt by that point. Along the way, you get, again, as you talk about in the book, you get Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the book. You get Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the film adaptation, which present a factory as this like hidden amusement park inside. Like it must be so neat to be in here, and all the chocolate waterfalls and the wonderful things that must be going on in here. What explains this shift to sort of openly embracing some of the factory elements?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really is the cultural story that I'm telling. It's this amazing moment. I mean, I think we tend to agree that the automation panic tends to sort of die down by the mid 60s. Ironically, as everyone likes to point out, when unemployment's actually more of a problem than it was in the 50s. So it's like the moment that you should be panicked, it's the moment that you're like, I think we're over that. Let's move on to something else. Um, and so I think
Could I
that's
could I
something.
could I offer a
Yeah,
theory for that?
yeah,
I
yeah,
just want to
please.
offer a theory for that. I think that the whole automation panic is linked to basically fear of what at the time was called totalitarian society. And I think basically after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the Soviet Union transforms from like an evil other to a nation that you're able to deal with. You know, you get JFK and the red phone, you get détente coming in the early 1970s. And so I really think the automation panic is related to employment, but at that moment in the early Cold War, it's primarily related to fascism and communism, which are viewed as automata. And basically, once that goes away, the fear of automation goes away. And I think you could prove that. I've been thinking about writing this for a long time. I think you could prove that by the fact that even though material things are worse in the mid 60s, there's much less of a fear of automation. In that, that's the real moment of industrialization. You know, I'm in the Pacific Northwest. It's basically the mid 60s when the timber industry totally collapses.
Mhm.
Also, when Kurt Cobain is born, and that's why you get grunge. That's another story. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to posit a thesis for that. Sorry to interrupt you, Roland.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that that's really when you begin to see that automation is an ideological concern, and that's why it's able to be so heavily abstracted, where it can be panic and leisure at the same time, because it's ultimately not about the sort of material effects on anyone's life. And so I think that's something really critical. So no, I absolutely love that. Um, the Where were we talking about? We were talking about the sort of sort of the denuding, let's say, of the technology into
Right.
sort of the factory.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's like I mean, Willy Wonka for me is a really sort of critical cultural moment where you really begin to see that. I think one of the things that Walt Disney was good at was in that sense of like, there's a great moment where they're preparing for the 64, 65 World's Fair. I discussed this in the book, and they're touring the Ford factories to basically produce a ride for Ford. And as the story gets told from those who were there with him, he sort of looks at this molten ingot conveyor and he's like, "That would make a good ride. Can we make that into a ride?" And it's interesting because it's not like the brilliant engineer who sees a potential in this attraction. It's that Walt Disney's saying there's something seductive about this thing, and can we make that into an experience for riders? It's not someone saying, "Oh, well, we want to tell this type of story, so let's use this technology that's really like offers the best way of doing it." It's really it acknowledges that Walt Disney is taking that technology because he thinks that there is something seductive about it as a factory conveyor. And so the fact that by the moment that you have Charlie and Chocolate Factory or Willy Wonka, the factory has become this sort of hidden theme park, I think you really begin to see the sort of like complete slippage. And it's not just Willy Wonka, it's across sort of like the press. There's this idea of like, the tram to Roosevelt Island is, ride a Disneyland ride to work. It's this real association that these technologies at this point, you know them more from an amusement park than you do from a factory. So when you have to imagine a factory, well, maybe there's the Jungle Cruise inside of it rather than the machines that we're so accustomed to seeing. And I think that as our history goes by, Splash Mountain is a great one, by the time that you're sort of producing these attractions, in some ways there's less of a desire. I think in the 50s there was more like a desire to let's really make sure that this doesn't look like another attraction ride. Let's make sure that people aren't too reminded of the factory. By that point, I think people are more freed up, and the that sort of seduction of the technology is so powerful that it's like, no, let's Splash Mountain can actually be a flume ride. And of course, that's what I mean. If you go to Knott's Berry Farm, you're literally riding a logging attraction with all these animatronics who are logging, and it really leans completely into this idea of like, this is a this is a sort of factory technology as part of what the theming is. And of course that predates even Splash Mountain. It's sort of the reason that they make Splash Mountain, to compete with a thrill ride like that. So the real citation of the factory really becomes much more embraced, and that's something that I think is, to this day, has become really interesting. I think it's a pendulum constantly swinging. I think once we sort of get too familiar with the technology, we sort of swing more into like the highly themed space, and it's a constant back and forth that I think is how the theme park achieves that sort of um, translation power.
Well, I would also guess that it's related to, social alienation. I don't think it's a surprise that we've gotten the introduction of these hyper immersive worlds like Star Wars Land or whatever in a period of total alienation in society, that people want to feel like they're part of another world. I mean, and that's a larger discussion, but I've always read like the introduction of like, now you're in Star Wars, as and you're 45 years old, you don't have children. I think that is an
You've
indication of
paid a
genuine
ridiculous
alienation.
amount of money to
Yeah,
be in Star Wars, by the way. Yeah.
to drink a sugar drink. Sorry, Derek. I
Right.
didn't mean to interrupt you. Please.
No, well, this is sort of outside the scope of automation, but as an art historian, I think you mentioned this in the book, but as an art historian, like the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, okay, as it was originally conceived before they kind of watered it down to make it look like the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which are themselves a very watered down version of piracy in that period. Like, what do you make of the way that ride was originally designed and the somewhat shocking things that you have children riding through on these boats looking at, like plunder and, violent acts of burning and
Sexual
looting
assault implied,
towns,
right?
sexual assault? Like,
Yeah.
there's just some crazy stuff happening here for an amusement park, and I was curious, like, as an art historian, what do you kind of make of that?
So, Pirates of the Caribbean is probably one of the most interesting attractions because I think it captures everything that Walt Disney wanted of one of their attractions to do in this sort of complete narrative, taking you from the present into the past. I mean, I think there's a reason why a lot of the distinctly American spaces in the park are haunted by ghosts, which is a whole nother conversation we can have. But you really have this narrative that is pretty unsavory. And I mean, one of the things that I love about the discourse around Pirates since it opened is this feeling of like we've never not been in a culture war, because I love reading there's a moment in the 90s when they try to tone down this, the sort of explicit like rape implications of the men chasing all the women in the attraction. And then it's like this entire outrage. I think it's 97 outrage of op-ed letters being sent all over like the local press, which is basically like, this is PC Disney and they're ruining Pirates of the Caribbean because they're getting rid of all the rape scenes. And I'm just always like, I mean, really? Like, I'm curious, like, where our sort
Derek
of
actually
moral
led that
compass lies.
campaign.
Yeah, that was one of my first, political acts.
Stepping onto the public stage.
Well, I mean, I had fond memories of Pirates of the Caribbean. Can actually, like, this is a total
Please.
digression, but, as a kid, like, we went to Disney World a few times. I never went to Disneyland, but we went to Disney World a few times
Yeah.
as a kid. And there was one trip where, like, we went on Pirates of the Caribbean, and I was of an age where, like, it was so cool, like, the pirates and the guns and the stuff. I was so excited, and I made I can't remember if my dad or my grandfather, they were both on the trip, but I made one of them get me, like, one of those, like, cheap pirate pistols, uh, like, as a toy, and we actually got busted at the airport because they thought we were carrying a firearm in one of our suitcases on the way back. Like, I have a distinct memory of that. I don't remember all the details because I was too young to really get it, but I have a distinct memory of like this huge kerfuffle at the airport because of this toy gun that was in the suitcase. Sorry.
No, that's pretty great. I have this great moment that, in many ways, captures a lot of my thinking about Disneyland. I was standing outside of the Matterhorn, and they have like this footprint of the Yeti, and there was an employee, a cast member, standing by, and a kid came up to him and was like, "Is this a real thing?" And he looks at him and he goes, "Can you touch it? Can you feel it? Then it's real." And it was like this great moment of like, but what is the child actually asking? Like, yeah, he knows it's a real object, but is it a real footprint? And like there was just like this wonderful moment of like the very sort of studied, perfect answer that he gave that was like, it's real because it's here. It is what it is. And I think that's what basically happened at the airport when you were trying to get through with your toy gun. It was real in some capacity.
It was, yeah,
The
it was real in some.
correspondence theory of truth. Roland, I think we should probably end on what this question, which I know a lot of our listeners are interested in, which is this question of labor and automation in Disney. And obviously,
Yeah.
Disney has become a site of a lot of discussion around labor and like you said, employees, cast members, and so sort of that, are they cast members? Do they get us some? I almost said reparations. That isn't right. Do they get residuals for their work? No. And so this is an interesting issue. So could we talk about that, and then we'll end there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that that's obviously like the hidden sort of conversation that's also happening a lot of these moments with what an automated theme park was. And this actually comes up explicitly with Disney, especially in the moment that they developed the audio animatronics. It's that caused a lot of, it's not something that is often discussed, but it definitely seems to have caused a lot of concern with his so-called Imagineers, that they were, when they did the Tiki Room, that was fine. Like, fine if you make animatronic birds. But when you started making human animatronics like Abraham Lincoln, the Carousel of Progress, all of that, Pirates of the Caribbean, there was this idea of like, are we stepping onto sort of human labor and human actors in particular, which I think is so relevant now thinking about, figures like Tilly Norwood, and like these AI actors and these conversations that we're having. And it's funny because it's not sort of quiet. Like, it's in the press. Like, I think it's Life magazine covering Pirates of the Caribbean. They're like, they start off this whole story about pirates talking about like, well, the labor unions are going to have an issue with this because you're replacing human actors with robotic actors. And so that's something that's, I think, in the very theming of the park, and what you see is, I think, ventriloquized through these machines. And I think it's also like a huge reality also with like the actual labor that happens in the park. I mean, it's no secret that Disney has had a huge amount of like labor activism around it in many capacities. This idea of cast members, I was thinking about this the other day of residuals also in terms of like, the set designers and all the industry people who would normally be working on Hollywood films, who are now making, when you're making sets for Disney, you're not getting residuals every time someone rides the ride. And so it's really something that has been a very ongoing conversation. I think one of the interesting parts of also spending a lot of time in the park and getting to know people who work in the park is also something that I felt was very American, in how we sort of tend to exist, which is this recognition of the limitations and the problems, and where it's a question. It can be as simple as like, you know how much is like a VIP tour guide making an hour versus like what the guests are paying an hour, questions like that. But then there's always, as much as I would ever hear anyone complain about that, there's also then this idea of like, but I get to work at the happiest place on earth. And I think that's that like double bind of like, love and hate, or like understanding the challenges and the embrace, is I think something that really told me a lot about how to handle the park also, and how I discuss it, because it is also this idea of representing these challenges of like, which are not, it's sort of in a sort of labor aspect, like the challenge of automation. Like, there was a panic about automation, but you were also embracing it at the same time. And I think that that's what distinctly marks the theme park also, in all of its sort of complexities, as this perfect mirror to how we operate as a society. I think in some ways, Disneyland is more of a microcosm of America than it would want to be. And I think that that's one of the sort of biggest takeaways that I had in really spending time there. And also, just giving the respect that's due to the idea that also like Disneyland in particular, unlike Walt Disney, where you drive into the abyss of the Florida wilderness and then go into this sort of, you know, magical place, separated from humanity. Disneyland is very much of like an urban park. Like, it's very much ingrained in Southern California's fabric. In Anaheim, it's a very diverse space, especially like in the people, like the pass holders and the cast members as well. It's a very queer space. And so it's actually really interesting how like just the labor on the ground so much subverts the narratives and assumptions. And I think especially like as academics, it's very easy to have about this place. And so I left it these conversations about automation and labor, I really left it with this very nuanced understanding of the complexities of what is actually happening on the ground, and how a lot of these tensions are negotiated in ways that are not necessarily the best answers, but they are sort of reflections of how we sort of metabolize these ideas on sort of cultural level. So it is something that is really fascinating to me, and I think like things like employee trading are things that will continue to fascinate me and probably sort of will lead to future work in this space.
So I think that's a good place to end, Roland. Although I'm gonna pitch you on doing a Disney World follow up to this book because I do think like
Oh,
the
absolutely.
expansions of
Trilogy.
Disney World are really interesting. Like Epcot, sort of openly embracing, really openly embracing the technology. Main Street, which is just like pulling, you talk about the Hollywood backlot. I mean, it is the Hollywood backlot, and taking that, pulling that curtain away. But then they brought they did the Animal Kingdom,
Mm.
which feels like going in the other direction. Like you're trying to kind of uh kind of submerge this stuff again, this time under sort of a zoo concept, but it really feels like a wild swing. So I don't know. I think you should. I think there's a lot there to be mined.
Oh yeah, I mean, I like to call Walt Disney World like proofread Disneyland. It's really like where they're like, okay, we learned our lessons, and now we're gonna really do this. And so I do have a very like big soft spot for Walt Disney World, and Disney World is probably my favorite in the ways in which it really captures a lot of like what Disney wanted to do on the scale, and really the magnitude of what Disneyland is really sort of just a tiny postage stamp. And places like Epcot Center really just capture, especially today, even this sort of idealism and sort of the heroism of technology from like the 70s, the 80s, and especially I feel the 90s. And so for me, I really, if I could write another book on anything Disney and had full access to all materials in the world, it would definitely be Epcot Center, because I think it's really captures both the sort of technology side and also, as an art historian, the representation of the world is something of endless fascination. And I think that probably only like a place like Las Vegas would capture sort of the level of meticulous detail in the way that a place like Epcot does. So it really is sort of one of those dream projects on the side.
All right, well, there's your next book idea. So we'll have you back to talk about it. The book is Disneyland and the Rise of Automation: How Technology Created the Happiest Place on Earth. Roland, thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really great.